All right, we will continue with where we left off yesterday. What we are doing is a very tediously slow introduction to sensitivity, clairvoyance, insight, and spiritual sight. We talked about sensitivity yesterday, and we mentioned that clairvoyance is a heightened sensitivity where one can perceive in a world rather than just indirectly experience it. And we talked about insight being intuitive awareness of the truth behind the forms that one sees with clairvoyance. And we said that spiritual sight was with what occurred when there was insight within the perceptive process, so that you not only could see, but you could understand and know what the truth was of what you were seeing. We talked a little bit about spiritual sight in the material world, where you look at things and see what they are. Now we left off talking about etheric perception, and we discussed sensitivity in people who are loosely connected with the physical body, so that the consciousness could be redirected into the etheric body, and then there would be a perception or some kind of experience of the etheric world. Now, let's do a little bit of review of the series of talks that began before this one, which was called What is an Aura? This series of talks is called Are Hallucinations Real? We said that beside the solids, liquids, and gases of the physical world, there was also an etheric realm that was part of the physical world. And that in that etheric part of the physical world, there were 4 etheric states. In Rosicrucian Christian mysticism, they are called the chemical ether, the life ether, the light ether, and the reflecting ether. The chemical ether is the energy of physics and chemistry. It accomplishes, among other things, chemical and some biological activities, attraction and repulsion of chemical stuff. The life ether is the vital ether. It facilitates living. And anything that has an organized, individuated life ether body lives. It has a special affinity to water, which is why all living things must have water. Everything that we see, especially these gardens that are being developed out here, are sustained by life ether. These 2 ethers together, they're sometimes called lower ethers, but they're usually called the biological ethers, because they take care of biological activities in all living bodies. The light ether is responsible for circulation in the material world. In us, it's the circulation of the blood. Any other fluids, lymph, things like that are also circulated by the light ether, but not so much as the blood. The light ether is also responsible for coloration and for the sense perception in our bodies. The light ether, working through what is sometimes called a nervous fluid that is specialized along nerves, receives impulses from the external world and carries them along to the etheric brain, whence it goes into the inner bodies. We'll get to that in a little bit in our review. This is a lot of review today. The reflecting ether is the vehicle for bringing thought into the physical body. It is not the origin of thought. That occurs in the mind, which is made of thought stuff. It is the vehicle for bringing the thoughts in and carrying them out, ramifying them. At its negative pole, it holds images, primarily memory images. These two ethers, which are associated more with higher qualities, not just biological subsistence, but qualities of experiencing the world and doing something with the world, are called soul ethers. Together, they form what is called a soul body. The etheric ethers do not have to take the shape of the dense physical body. To some extent they do, but they are more seen as draping light. It's usually seen as an etheric aura, especially the light ether is that way. The biological ethers are limited. It's much like Christ says in the Bible, "Who among you by taking thought can increase his stature by 1 cubit?" They're limited. We can only have so much matter, and we can only have so much vitality to sustain the physical body. The soul ethers are relatively unlimited. There is no limit to the amount of light and lucidity that we can have in our soul bodies. When the soul ethers are rich enough, and only when they are rich enough, and when they are organized by spiritual exercises, they can be stratified in such a way that the soul ethers can be disentangled from the biological ethers and suspended from them, and in a way detached. And then one can put one's attention by spiritual exercises not in the physical, which is our ordinary habit. Most people think they only have consciousness when they are in the physical body, and that becomes habituation. And in order to grow into spiritual states, we have to be deconditioned from the habits that we have of thinking that consciousness is in a certain way. But if we can take our consciousness out of the feeling of somatic existence and put it into the soul ethers, we can take soul trips. Meaning to say, we can dissociate the consciousness from the physical body, and we can go wherever we will in the inner worlds. Now, these kinds of exercises require great control and very exacting precision. They are not mechanical exercises, though there are mechanical facets to them. They are spiritual exercises. So anyone that thinks that things are accomplished by a mechanical activity such as breathing or certain kinds of exercises, those are mechanical functions. They're not spiritual. It's only when the consciousness in the spirit is attuned and focused that one has accomplished something through a spiritual exercises. Now, the advanced exercises of this type are dangerous. We've had questions about insanity, which occurs when there are actual breakages somewhere along the line of consciousness going from the spirit through the thoughts and the desires and the ethers for energy and into the physical. If there are breaks in the consciousness along the way, the spirit can't get through to the personality, and the personality can't get through to the spirit, and such a state is called insanity. So if we're trying to dissociate consciousness of one vehicle from another, or within a vehicle, as in the case of the vital body, it can be very dangerous. So the advanced exercises, which cannot be given out by somebody like me, they have to be given out by someone who is very spiritually knowing. If they are not carried out correctly, they can result in disability or insanity. For example, if you try to separate the ethers and you do it wrong, you can leave yourself basically as becoming a mineral. If you pull some of the life ether away from the chemical while you're trying to dissociate, the body gets into a hardened kind of state, and that hardened kind of state is very much like tuberculosis. So you have to be really careful about those kinds of exercises. If there is not enough soul material, and the soul material is not organized, to do any exercise of this type is pointless. The spiritual exercises you can do at any time. But if you don't have the material, if you don't have the stuff to put your consciousness in, there's no use in trying to put your consciousness in it. It just isn't there. When one has lived a sufficiently serving life where everything is done for the sake of others or for the God's sake, when one does that, one attracts the stuff of the soul material. And if one has that material, you don't have to worry about learning how to stratify the etheric body and to put your consciousness in the higher ethers. There is a tremendous amount of suffering in the world, of all kinds of suffering, physical, psychological, everything we can think of. And the attitude among spiritual beings is, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, there are many people that are cheering for us and are pulling for us that we can make the grade, that we can become sufficiently selfless and sufficiently serving so that they can teach us how to do these things. So you don't have to worry about whether there are going to be whether you're going to be taught things. Now, we've reviewed enough, and we can begin talking about what is called sometimes etheric vision or etheric clairvoyance. Both of those terms are not good terms because they relate us too much to our concept of vision. And etheric phenomena are not quite exactly like our vision. So let's just say etheric perception is a better word and try to look at that. Non-clairvoyant people, or sometimes even clairvoyant people, have illusions about the varieties and the real true nature of inner perception. One of those illusions is, all I have to do is open inner perception and I will know how to use it and I will know what it means. That is a big illusion. A lot of our problems in life in general is we presume we know things that we don't know. We presume we can do things that we can't do. There are analogies that help us to understand our illusions. The most obvious one that all of us have seen is an infant. The infant has the capacity to see, but it isn't able to do so rightly to begin with. Infants will be trying to reach something that's across the room. They'll try to reach for the light bulb in the ceiling. And an infant has to go through a long process of learning what their perception is and what it means and how it works. It's a process that goes just beyond visual perception. For example, we have to know what a smile means. And we have to know what a sardonic smile means. They're both very different things. So the meaning of perception and perception is actually an ongoing activity. All of us, at some time or another, as we become familiar with the material world, we recognize things, we become familiar with them, and we assume that we see them. But if we are educated into the perceptive process, we can find that we really don't see things clearly, and that there are ways of seeing that we can do better with. very few people consider seeing an ongoing process. I have friends that are artists. Some of them paint every day, or they draw every day, and they wouldn't think of going through a day without painting or drawing any more than they would think of going through a day without eating. They know that by continuing to look, the perception gets clearer, and the understanding, and especially the appreciation of the external world, is much improved. If you think about it, our process with physical senses, which are very different from the inner senses which we're trying to get to, is very indirect. And let's just look at that for a second and see how indirect it is. In the first place, we don't see objects. We see light reflected off of objects. That light is collected through a lens, and it's inverted by that lens. And that each person's eye has a different characteristic from each other person's eye. We are all looking through different quality or different grades of ocular lenses. Then light goes through the aqueous humor and it falls on the retina. And in the retina, a two-dimensional image is formed on the rods and the cones, and that is different for each of us also. A lot of people, whether they know it or not, have slightly detached retinas, and this causes a little bit of obscuring of what they're seeing or distorting of what they're seeing. Some people are colorblind. I worked with a man who had both varieties. He had yellow-violet and red-green colorblind, and the man saw nothing but shades of gray between black and white. And do you know his consciousness was like that? He was a gray person. He didn't have a lot of colorful desires either. It's just amazing the parallels between the different worlds and the way they happen in a person's body. At any rate, the image is neurally encoded and is carried along the optic nerve by the ethers to the etheric brain. And then it is reassembled in various parts of the brain. And from the physical brain, it goes to the etheric brain, and from the etheric brain, it is impressed in the desire body, and eventually it is communicated to the mind, and eventually the spirit sees something. This is a very indirect process. This is, our vision is wonderful. As we mentioned in an earlier talk, a person can see a match struck miles away. If you're like on a desert mountain in the pitch of the night, you can strike a match and somebody 5-10 miles away can see that. There are other pathways between the body and the spirit, but this is the primary one, especially the one that we use, either through the ear and the auditory nerve or the eye and the optic nerve, is how we bring things in. Each sense that we have relates to a different part of matter. Now, it's true that the spirit can compensate and correct and adjust for all of the variation and all of the inversions in the lens and all of that, but still it's indirect. Even if we perfect all of our senses, the spirit still gets only a partial and incomplete perception of the external material world. So it behooves us to be careful of making assumptions and remember that they are assumptions when we make them. We have to assume some things in order to function in the world, but it's wise to limit the number of assumptions we make and not to have presuming attitudes. developmental learning and work does not always begin at infancy. We have other examples of people who are congenitally blind, and then they receive sight. Sometimes they're in an accident and they're jarred, and a blockage or a pinching of the optic nerve is relieved and they begin to see. When people do that, they often close their eyes to get around at first because it's much easier for them. They're used to functioning in that way. Those are exactly the same kinds of words that are used by beginning clairvoyance. Max Heindel, for example, mentions that people who become conscious invisible helpers, even though they may have been excellent unconscious invisible helpers when they left their body in sleep, once they become conscious, they are useless for up to half a year or so because it is so confusing. The experience of the inner worlds is almost overwhelmingly confusing, and one has to learn all over again, and one has to have composure and begin to see everything very differently than things were seen before. Now, we're trying to talk about etheric vision today, or etheric perception. The fundamental thing to remember with etheric perception is that you're not looking at form the way you look at form in the physical world. Etheric perception is perceiving energy with energy, or perceiving energy through energy. Now, there are various different ways that we can perceive etherically, and some people experience them, some people do not. But let's look at some very simple ones. Simple, direct etheric perception of energy perceiving energy is part of what the senses are. The sight, the sound, the touch, etc. Heat, all of those. What it means is calling one's attention directly to the etheric body and experiencing through it. Now, I've met people in life that had etheric perception and they didn't know it. I mentioned an experience of my own. When I was a young man, I was waiting for a friend and lying on a sofa with my eyes closed in a peaceful state, and my friend's cat came along the top of the sofa. And I didn't see the cat, but I knew the cat was there, because as the cat came toward me, I could experience and feel a billowing energy on a small scale, like a cloud billows and circulates. And at the same time, I could feel the energies coming out of my body, going toward the cat in order for energy to meet energy. Now, that is a very primitive thing. It wasn't visual like with the eyes, but yet I was experiencing an etheric field. I think every one of us has had experiences like this. It's not even a high degree of clairvoyance. It's just that you're in a relaxed state and you're forgetting about the material world, and your attention is in the energy, and you understand your energy field relative to other energy fields around you. Very simple example. Another example, I knew a man that I worked with him for a while that was a computer programmer, and he worked with massive programs, thousands of lines of code. And the way he would debug is he would page through the code and he'd run his hand over the code, and when something felt funny, he knew that there was a bug. There was an error. It was a form of etheric perception. Blind people who don't use their eyes do learn to focus in the realms of energy. And blind people can see color, and they can tell you what the color of a painting is just by putting their hand over it. They don't even have to touch. They get to the point that they put their consciousness in the ethers. Now, those are very primitive forms, but those are still, there are still etheric types of perceptions. I hope this isn't going too slow. I try not to, I want to be very slow and very deliberate. So these are not very good perceptions. Let's try to get away from primitive things and try to get to much better forms. All of our varieties of perception that we have right now are limited. One of the best ways of obtaining etheric data has a surprising limitation with regard to the chemical region of the physical worlds. All of our senses have been developed and evolved in relation to reality, some quality of reality. The eye sees light, the sound hears. If we carry something in our hand, we get the heft of gravity. If we touch something hot or cold, we sense the intensity of temperature. And these are all adaptive perceptions to states of reality. But none of them is complete. Many, many years before Einstein, mysticism has taught that there's only one substance. And that substance goes much, much further than the matter and energy that Einstein speaks of in his conservation principle. It goes much further than that. This substance is called in Rosicrucian Christian mysticism cosmic root substance. Now when you think of this, when you think of a substance, this is not like soil as a substance. This is more like substance as a potentiality of being something. That's a tough way of saying it, but it's very abstract. If you want to hear a technical way of saying it, Rosicrucians teach that cosmic root substance is a neutral monism with an internal dualism. And that's a fancy way of saying that this substance, which is the potential of being something, is neutral. It's not biased one way or another. That's what a neutral monism means. But that the simplest differentiation is the differentiation into two. And so that it has within it a polar dualism. It doesn't have an end, doesn't have a beginning. It just has the potential of being something. That's a fancy way of saying that if something comes into being in one direction of this dual differentiation, we call it matter. If something comes into being in the other direction of this differentiation, we call it spirit. It's called the spirit-matter pole, and mystics of all varieties and of all degrees of mysticism agree that there is this experience that in one direction things become more material, in the other direction things become more spiritual, but it's all one thing that is capable of metamorphizing in various different directions and dimensions. It's all the same stuff. When it is more material, it's thought stuff. And when it's even more material, it's desire stuff. And when it's even more material, it is the etheric stuff. So it is a one stuff. It's a continuum. It is one. So that everything runs from the grossest matter that we can conceive to the rarest state of spirituality that can be conceived.
It has the potential of all the frequencies possible.
That's correct. That's correct. But the frequencies are not quite the way we see them in physics. because when you're in the desire world, the frequencies they're totally different laws. There still is a vibratory quality, but the laws of the desire world are altogether different than the laws of the physical etheric, and again, altogether different from the world of thinking. And the same is true with each of the planes. They are differentiations of the one stuff. So, what happens is we have perceptions that see in one part of this continuum. For example, sound is one part of the continuum. Heat is another. Light is another. Desire stuff is another. That's a big jump in difference there. So we have evolved senses for only various segments. We don't have senses for the entire continuum, at least not yet. For example, we hear sound, but we don't hear the same sounds that a dog hears, or that a dolphin hears, or that a bat hears. We see light, but we don't see into the infrared, or we don't see into the ultraviolet, at least not yet. Insects can see into the ultraviolet. There are even some birds that can see into the infrared. This incomplete development, we have to specialize on some things first. And when we learn them, then we can expand our attention and our consciousness so that it takes in more and more and more of the different states until eventually we can see the whole of the spectrum of what is manifest in the cosmic root substance. So we have an incomplete sense of reality. We can smell a rose, but by smelling it, we can't tell what it looks like. Helen Keller could feel the petals of a rose, and she could tell you whether it was a white rose or a red rose just by feeling it. We can look at a violin, and we can't tell what it sounds like. We look at it, and it's a strange shape that we don't see every day. So each of our senses is limited to a small part of that continuum. And what it is we develop attitudes. And those attitudes are that we think we know reality because we're beginning to understand one part of the spectrum. And we don't know what we're missing. And that's what clairvoyance is all about. It's a very hard thing to tell a deaf person that they're missing something in not being able to hear music. It's a very difficult... Deaf people do not want to be considered having a disability. The American Society for the Deaf says we are not a disability, except when it comes to public assistance. I'm not speaking down about public assistance. I'm all for it, but I am speaking about the inconsistency. Now, even though we are in a full reality, and even if we are presented with full data, we can't appreciate it, and we can only perceive certain aspects of it. Our consciousness can be awakened to that, and then we have a broader experience. A good case example is what Rosicrucian Christian mystics call the breath record. Each time we take a breath, in the very air that we are taking in, the ether in that air carries to our lungs a picture of the entire environment around us. I shouldn't say a picture. It carries in an experience of the entire environment around us. It goes into the bloodstream, and it's recorded in various places. It's recorded in the negative pole of the reflecting ether. Everything that we experience, even the things we are not aware of, Like if there are attitudes that we have toward other people or other people have toward us and we don't know it, that's still carried because that's really in the atmosphere. When we die, and we are then very much sensitized because our etheric body is removed from the physical, we are no longer winding forward, we are no longer continuing to produce this panorama of pictures, and what happens is they begin unwinding. And we see our entire life backward. When we do that, we're still only conscious of part of the things. It's amazing of what does happen. If you've ever spoken to any person who's experienced that from a fall from a high place or a near drowning, they are astounded at what is in those pictures. Things they never knew were there. And it's a very transformative experience. So this is, we see everything in retrospect. But we can still only see the things we're capable of seeing. We may not be able to see the feelings that are in the air. So, someone who has etheric vision, that is someone who has extended their sensitivity and has been consciously able to attune their awareness through sensitivity to various other states along the continuum, can see those things within the records that we all carry. We have a lot of evolving to do. We have a lot of things to become aware of. There are a lot of people that would say they would like to check out and say, I'm all done, I've learned everything I'm going to learn, I'm a good person, God take me. Such an individual has no idea of what a wonderfully big process we are in and all the glories that we are capable, and it is our duty to unfold an awareness of. The idea, one doesn't have to manufacture false praise, as this happens in some churches sometimes, because there's just so much that if you don't praise what is reality, something is radically wrong with you. So what we have said in a tedious way is that the full spectrum of reality is presented to us and we need to unfold it. It's not going to just happen to us. If something just happens to us, it's a sign of some kind of devolutionary faculty. We are self-conscious now. We are awake now. And with that waking consciousness comes responsibility. We have duties and we have privileges to work out. And we do that freely and we do that voluntarily. Yes. I'm finding that every year that I get older, I like work more. And work isn't always what we thought it was. Even this kind of activity is work. But it's worth every bit of it. For all of the specialization and sophistication that we have in physical etheric organisms, there is one sense in which we are in our vital bodies still like amoebas. And this will be a long little excursus into something about evolution, to understand something about etheric perception and what we can do about it. What material science considers evolution, from studying fossils and studying sedimentation and doing age dating and looking at organic atavisms and looking at DNA tracing, most of what they find is true. There's some that is not. But true though it may be, it is part of a much bigger evolution. Madame Blavatsky describes it as looking at 1 inch in the middle of the yardstick. Just the inch that has to do with the material world and things before the material world existed that are still found impressed in the material world. And in the same way that 1 inch in the yardstick is broken into segments, regular segments, so each foot is broken into regular segments, and so the yardstick is broken into the same analogous kind of regular segments. What science is looking at in the dense physical world is a recapitulation of what has been developed in rudimentary ways in higher spiritual worlds in much earlier periods of creation. Now, what we're saying is something that most of us don't experience. So if you're looking all for direct first-hand experience, you may want to consider this all like a gigantic fairy tale. It's easier to accept it as a fairy tale, and if it intuitively appears to be true, or if there are parts of it that are apparently true, so much the better. Material science looks only at the form, the dense physical matter. And it only looks at it in the most recent period of history, which in mysticism we call the Earth period. It's looking at the time when our solar system formed into planets and a sun, dense material bodies within the organization of God. Before that, it existed in higher realms. There was an evolution within the ongoing creation that was there before there was even an etheric plane. Since everything in the work of evolutionary creation proceeds from within out, every time there is a new advance in creativity or in an evolutionary form, you go right back to the beginning and you start all over again and work from within out. It's like if you want to change underwear, you can't change underwear with your clothes on. You have to go all the way back to the nude state, then put on the new underwear, and then put on the new clothes on top. Everything works from within on. You don't just add things on from the outside. So every time there's a new advance, you build on everything that came before, because everything works in a cyclical, spiral kind of way. There's progress, which is linear, but there's cyclicity, which repeats things, so you see things from all points of view, and the two of them put together is a very slow, thorough spiral process. Our Earth in the Earth period is a very special case with regard to this principle. Everything in this physical plane in 3 dimensions is without. And because everything is without and our experience is without, we have a monopolar perception of the world. We can only see outsides. Now that's a special case. Even if we want to look inside someone's body, we have to take it and cut it open, and what do we find when we cut it open? A new outside. And that's what our perception is like, because we have this indirect, reflective kind of perception. That's not the way it is with the spiritual worlds. With the spiritual worlds, perception is more direct. We are within, and within the energy, we can put our attention with the thing that we are perceiving or experiencing it, and experiencing it as it experiences itself. It's very, very direct, and it's not indirect. Now, we recapitulated as human beings all of our previous states. We recapitulated animal-like states, we recapitulated plant-like states, and we recapitulated a mineral-like state. Now, the spiritual hierarchies, the Elohim or the gods, or whatever name you wish to call them, could see that we were coming into this very physical monopolar state. And they realized that there would not be much progress and there would not be much appreciation of all of the discrete phenomena that there are in this state if we remained as unified or unit beings. We were one-like. We were like an amoeba. The earlier stages of our human-like existence, the seers claim, and you can go back to Plato and find it, and you can find it in Max Heindel, you can find it in other places, that we were big, single-cell, bag-like creatures. And in that single-cell state, we had creative capacities in us because we had all of the evolution that brought us to be human-like. That is, we had the evolution that gave us a form, an evolution that gave us vitality, that we could live and grow and repair ourselves. We had an evolution that brought us into contact with emotions and feelings and moods and all of the things that permeate our desire life. And beyond that, we had the beginnings of a mind. So even though we were big bag-like creatures, our capacities inward were very different, were very much more elaborate and much more capable than we would think when we think of something like an amoeba. But nonetheless, if we were going to learn discrete, objective lessons in this world, which is the value of this world, all of the limitations, I can't put my hand through that. That limitation is something that gives me a very objective understanding of what a thing is, what a form is, and the fact that it has a certain color. All of the limits of this world were here to help us awaken very objective understandings of reality. And because we're like babies, we begin with very simple understandings of reality, and when we develop an objectivity, then we expand it until that objectivity reaches further and further into reality, and soon we have an objective understanding of all. So we had these bag-like bodies, but something had to be done so that we could have more discrete bodies. Moreover, we had to have in our bodies the capacity to think. We had to have the ability for the spirit to come into the body and see and perceive and know exactly what it was experiencing. I don't mean merely vision. And so our bodies had to be changed. And it's a curious thing in an epoch. An epoch means an arc of time. That previously we had gone through epochs called the Polarian epoch and the Hyperborean epoch, at which times we were more energy beings and the planets and the physical earth hadn't even formed yet. But as we came into the planets, with the formation of the planets, we had to develop ramified bodies. And so what happened is part of our energy was divided so that we could do creative work and evolve a brain and all the wonders that are in our body, and part of it was used to share in procreation. Because if we were like single-cell beings in this world, we could only have an amoeba-like experience. We could reproduce ourselves by splitting in half and going with the new half instead of the old one, but there wouldn't be any progress. There wouldn't be the glory that is the human body now and the consciousness that goes with it. So the energy was divided, and in effect, it's like the creative nucleus was separated and the energy ectoplasm was separated. And so it was something like this, that the area of the sacrum and the genitals was one part of the divided creativity. The other part was the voice box and the developing brain. One center was used for sharing with others to build new bodies, and the rest was used for creative work or becoming gods. And so that way we could continue to experience in this world and learn all of the objective experiences in this world while at the same time evolving. So it's a cooperative effort. Now, for the ectoplasm, or meaning to say, where the energy flow, not the central creative part, where it broke was at the center of the feet and the center of the hands. The crucifixion spots, where the nails went through. They become very important when one leaves the body and travels in the etheric soul body. So, from then on, we have been evolving more and more forms. Our own forms and the forms of others. Because before we began to waste the divine creative energy, we still had magical creative abilities. And so the forms of all the animals around us, we helped those forms come into being when we still had the word of power at the one creative nucleus. This is what it means in the book of Genesis when it says Adam and Eve named the animals. We have the human capacity to conceive the thoughts and to understand the thought form of the divine intent of the different animals, and we were a focus into the world, and by speaking the word, we produced the matrices that became the forms that evolved as the different animals. Now, this is a very big topic, and we're not going to talk on it. We'll just let that be a tantalizing teaser because it would be way too much of a distraction to go into that. The point is that we didn't evolve from the animals evolved from us. That doesn't mean that we didn't have an animal-like state, but that was in a much deeper period back in evolutionary history when we were still worked on by the creative hierarchies, and but not these animals that are here. We didn't evolve from them; they evolved from us. Yeah, it's quite a remarkable thing. In fact, our entire evolutionary consciousness in all the states of the principles that we use in our back evolution is to be found. We spoke out ourselves when we formed the animals, and the principles of each of those states is built in each of the plants and animals that are left. So there is an evolutionary record of the entire creation in a limited material form throughout the chain of life in what we see in visible evolution going on around us. But that's, again, starting to get far afield, and I have to be careful or I'll run away. And so we became gendered. The division was not only a division between the higher creative nucleus and the lower creative nucleus. It was done in such a way that we produced bodies that could work cooperatively. This was done on the etheric physical level, such that when we came to birth in a masculine body, we were outwardly positive, but we were inwardly negative in the etheric vehicle. And when we take incarnation into a female body, when we're reborn in that way, the outer body is receptive and feminine. The inner body is positive, and it is the inner body that builds the matrix. And even if a man could have a womb, a man could not produce a baby because the etheric body is not charged for that kind of creation. So we take turns being male and female, and we share part of our energy outward in building bodies so that other people can continue to make progress and that we can all grow together. But at the same time, when we're not wasting and we're not spending all of that energy, and when we don't have to do it all by the sweat of our brow, we can start turning it upward and we become creative beings. So we have these two creative centers. One is biological, procreative, sensual. It is very instinctual. It's very hard to control the instinctuality of sex. It wants to make new forms. That is its purpose, and it is a creative power that is very hard to deny. The other part is a more intellectual creative power. It's more spiritual. It's supersensual. It can be very strong depending on what we've done with it. Now, there is unlimited energy in the world, both in terms of what is in the white of the egg, that is, in the etheric flux, and in the creative specialization of that energy, but only from life to life, from what we have learned, do we build up more and more of that energy, which in a psychological sense is called libido. It's got different names according to the way it is being used. So the bricks in the ectoplasm, so to speak, of the etheric body are located in the palms of the hand and the palms of the feet. So one can imagine a human being straightening out, working from an egg-like fetal position to becoming upright, and eventually, as we become outward, our whole body will be for radiating creation out from ourselves, and we will actually bend over backwards, exactly as that when we do something for its own sake, when we do something for the sake of friendship, we say we bend over backwards. And that colloquialism in speech is very insightful into our human evolution, and eventually we will again reunite the two centers, but totally as creative beings, no longer as sensual beings. Now, anyway, as we strengthen our vital body, even the biological part of the vital body, streams of energy come in through the palms of the hand and through the palms of the feet, but mostly they stream out. In earlier talks, we have talked about how one builds up vital energy, and there will be some more in later talks. But if one attunes one's energy, one's consciousness to the energy, one can do things with that energy. Just as I said, the man that I worked with could find the bugs in his computer program because he was directly perceiving through the energy itself. There are people that can bring spiritual qualities through from the divine realms and bring it through the ethers, and they can lay hands on other people, and those people have remarkable spiritual experiences. There are people that learn to do magnetic healing, and they can draw energy off of people, or if you do it right, you can do mesmeric passes, and you can put people into states of trance or things like that. In fact, there are even two kinds of palmists. One kind of palmist reads the lines in your hand. And since there are so many nerves between the brain and the hand is a pretty good representation of what the consciousness is that functions through the brain. And so the lines in the hand, palmistry does work. It's worked through, I've watched my palm change throughout life, and I just studied a few rudiments of palmistry, and it works. There's another kind of palmistry, though, where you go and you see someone who is usually an involuntary clairvoyant. And they look in your palm, and they see at the center of your palm like a little bitty screen, like a movie screen. It's a Palm Pilot in a different way. And so the energy of the vital body is streaming out, and within that energy are the pictures of all the things that we've done in our life, and even some of the major pictures of things that are yet to come in our life. And so a palmist looks at that, and they start seeing those pictures with an involuntary clairvoyance, and they are apparently great seers. Now, the ethers, they pass right through us. So, if one has one's attention in the ethers, there is an innerness or a throughness that one has in that etheric perception. Though it is very powerful, by laying your hands on things and perceiving, it's a direct, it's seeing of energy through energy, but it's not a very good way of seeing. It's rather crude. It's not as crude as my laying on the sofa and seeing the aura or perceiving the aura of my friend's cat, but it is certainly not as sophisticated as the breath record, which contains everything. Now, as humanity has evolved, the communication between the two creative centers, at the sacrum and at the top of the spine, the communication has developed and it has become very advanced. The physical body, the cerebrospinal nervous system is amazing in its development. Now, parallel to this development is the development in the etheric vital body. Because the ethers have inwardness and outwardness, they are polar in nature. And they are a more appropriate vehicle for the character that wants to precipitate things in a polar way from within out and from without in. As we've looked at a human being that can only see outward, we're a monopole in that sense. And when we're a monopole and we look at the heart, we see only a blob of muscle. It's pretty sophisticated, but it's not the same thing as saying somebody is all heart, or that one has a heartfelt feeling, or it's not the same thing as saying getting at the heart of the matter. Now, those are not just colloquialisms. They are pointing at a different reality. So there is an etheric reality that relates to the cerebrospinal nervous system. And it's much more than just a biological sustainer. It is a vehicle for communication between two creative nuclei. This is especially the case in people who use the spinal fluid, which is not stuff that they take in spinal taps. That's only the physical counterpart. It's what is called the nervous fluid, the specialization of the two higher ethers. When that has not been spent in sexuality or sensualism, a person can put much more into their inner development. And it often takes place right along the cerebrospinal nervous system. Now, what we're going to talk about is something that is very deep and it's very dangerous. We're only going to mention it, and there's going to be a lot of warnings about it. There are centers of activity between the sacrum and the brain. And they are associated with activities in the physical body, but because there are so many nerves and neural plexes in these areas, they're sort of like little brains. They're like little centers of consciousness. They do the physical work, but they go beyond that. They are associated with each of the plexes in the nervous system. That is the solar plexus and the cardioplexus and the renal plexus. Wherever there is a major neural plexus, there is in that very complicated and very delicate mechanism within that, the etheric part of it goes beyond it and it produces like a little brain of activity. Now, each of these centers has a character. Part of the character has something to do with the character of the organs that they serve. The solar plexus is especially important because that is where the seat of the etheric vital body is. And when we draw in solar energy, not just from the ocean of energy that the Earth is suspended in, but the solar energy that comes in direct from the sun that replenishes the life here, when we draw that in, we usually draw that in through the spleen, and then the energy flows to the solar plexus, and in the solar plexus it passes over the seed of our entire etheric makeup that has been with us ever since we were plant-like. And then it is transformed into useful, vital stuff in our bodies. When people cannot get fresh food, for example, this becomes very important. If you ever read about expeditions of polar explorers, either at Antarctica or at the North Pole, they take special care that they get that sunlight. And they literally, even in the cold, take their clothing off so that they are exposed, so there's no inhibition to the sunlight as it comes in. So each of these centers associated with the neural plexes has a character that is all of its own. Now the etheric counterpart of the plexes have both active and responsive components. And they develop according to the conscious activity of the spirit that lives in the body. The passive parts can be activated, but it is a no-no. It is a very deadly no-no. If you start working with what are meant to be passive parts of the autonomic nervous system, you're asking for all kinds of trouble. Now these little brains become like they have their own faculties for etheric experience and etheric knowing. To call them faculties of etheric perception is not quite right, but there is a kind of knowing. They're only known by an ancient name that means wheel. They're called chakras. A better name to call them would be flowers, petaled flowers. And some of the petals are active and directable, and the others are passive and receptive. Now, some schools of mysticism place great emphasis on them. The Rosicrucian school of Christian mysticism does not do that. It does not do that, especially with people who are beginners. In the esoteric work, it is a little bit different. The reason for it is that because these centers are so sensitive, and so many people think that they can manipulate them like they're manipulating a top or a dial on a microwave or something like that. They think it's a mechanical device, and it isn't so. And one of the big problems is we have this materialistic consciousness, and we think everything is like matter, and all we have to do is mechanically change matter, and that's it. And such an attitude is extremely dangerous, because you can screw up your whole nervous system that way and cause great harm. For example, people who intentionally try to produce involuntary receptivity. Now, there are some people that we've said that are sensitives, that it comes second nature to them, and they have to be careful that they aren't too sensitive. And they get over, if they're not positive, psychopositive, what happens is they get taken over by entities in mediumship and things like that. But there are sometimes healthy, normal, positive people that want to become mediums. And you see what happens. They start messing with the centers in the autonomic nervous system or in the etheric counterparts of them, and they have all kinds of neurological problems. I've seen it case after case of people who try to become mediums, and they suddenly start getting tics. When I was here at Mount Ecclesia many years ago, back in the 60s, I saw a young man that was so proud of the fact that he said, I'm going to become a medium, and he was already starting to have tics, that he was having muscular actions that he couldn't control. Such a sad thing, just to have phenomena in the inner world that are available to you if you work in a positive way. So, the Rosicrucian school does not do much work with them, because people try to work with them in a wrong way mechanically. And there is a better way to go about it. These centers change, and they develop and they grow and they become activated in reaction or in relation to character development. Yes. Yes. According to what your character is, if you work on some aspects of being a good person and developing your conscious function, it follows right in the autonomic nervous system. And that's the way that system is built, and that is the way that system should be developed. It's a byproduct of soulfulness. Spiritual development is for the development of character. And if we do not develop character, it is not to our benefit, and any kind of psychic experience that we have will not be a good development. So, the more we have of moral character and of spiritual character, and we are principled beings, the more these things will follow, and they will come to us second nature. Once one has the soul, it's an easy thing to teach them the techniques that are necessary to utilize things. You have to have the soul before everything else. So we won't say anything more about that. Finally, we're at the edge of discussing true etheric perception. When we conserve sexual energy and transform it by our character, and we can raise it through the spine, through these different centers, and bring it up to the cranium, we can begin to unfold etheric vision and other kinds of higher faculties. Attaining to this readiness is something that is a matter of lifetimes. You have to conserve the sexual energy and not do so in such a way that you repress yourself and become psychologically damaged. You have to do it not with celibacy, but with chastity, so that you have a loving regard for the sexual function. It's even possible to be moderately sexually active and still progress spiritually, if it's done with that kind of attitude of reverence. One has to be careful, and one must put forth concerted effort and apply oneself with great patience, and gradually, by the act of doing things with the higher consciousness, the head and the heart, it draws this energy upward. That is, there is a transference of some of the creativity from the lower center to the higher center. You know what, I'm not trying to say that it is the sacrum, and I'm not trying to say that it is the genitals. I'm saying that it's a whole area, because it's an inner world thing, and even though we have quite developed sexual organs, it is not the sexual organs. We're talking about a center of creativity that is in a more primal or in a more pure state. I like the word life force or creative force better. Kundalini is a word, you speak two languages, and you know that there are words in one language that don't transliterate to the other, and there's an impossibility. And I don't like the use of that word because I don't know precisely what it means. It doesn't take into account most of the things that I read on using that word. It doesn't take into account the nature of the stuff. You would see it just as a fire. Now, I think a better word is the word that the psychoanalysts use, libido, because the libido has the energy, and it has the zest for life, and it has all of those things. It isn't just purely etheric. It's etheric and desire substance, and it's like a total substance. And so I refrain from using some words because if you can't transliterate the real meaning of the word, what happens is instead of being a word that communicates, it becomes a name. And when it's a name, then it's basically a form of name calling, and people hook their ideas onto names and not onto realities. That's never a wise thing to do. You know, I can almost picture people coming up to each other and saying, "How's your kundalini today?" You know, like saying, "How's your cat?" or something like that. So a big part of the work is controlling and directing the energies with painstaking control. But you have to have the energies first. You have to have soul power. And only through loving, self-forgetting service can you develop that soul power. That's the important thing. You have to have the stuff. You can't wake up what isn't there. At any rate, when the energy is beginning to flow into the cranium, or the inner world part of the cranium, or the inner world view of that same world that we call the cranium, it can be deflected by organs that are condensations of the etheric body. The mystics claim that the endocrine glands are not part of the physical body. They are condensations of the etheric body. And this is why they are not subject to the regulatory forces of the physical body. Most of the endocrine glands do not respond, or they do not report to the nervous system. The nervous system is ruled by the Holy Spirit, which is the third attribute of the threefold spirit. The second attribute, which is the life spirit that works through the ethers, works through the endocrine system. But they work in harmony. Things that are initiated by the endocrines are balanced off and refined by the nervous system, and things that are initiated by the nervous system, there is a response. We're still all one being, but they're just different attributes of the same being. So the pineal gland and the pituitary body are primary condensations out of the etheric realm. And when we put our attention into those energy centers, we can cause them to vibrate just like the cosmic root substance is vibrated by the Supreme Being to cause all the different states of spirit and matter within cosmic root substance. Probably not in the same way that the Supreme Being can activate the different, if you want to call them vibrations, it's not a good word, but we don't have another word, along the pole, spirit-matter pole of the cosmic root substance. In that same way, we in our spiritual being can activate by putting our attention in the etheric part of the pituitary body and pineal gland, and we can activate, and it is like making waves. That the energy rises, it's something like blowing on a candle. If you see a candle and you blow on it, the candle flickers. When you impinge a wave of energy on that rising fount of spinal energy, it gets moved over, and then wave after wave after wave moves it and makes an effectual but not actual bridge between those two organs, and that completes the circuit. And that circuit produces a flow of energy that goes in a lemniscat spiral between the two creative centers, and then tangentially off of that lemniscat flow, energy can be directed because you have it in excess. And that energy can then be passed out through the optic nerve, which is the blind spot in most people. And so this is why we are so habituated to reflecting off the retina that when we learn to have etheric vision and we have to do more with the optic nerve and the energy passing through it, we have to learn to focus all over again. And then when we come back to physical vision, we have to refocus again. And so it's the whole idea of we have to learn something. With that, we are capable of then projecting energy into the macrocosmic energy world at large. And this is what is called a direct etheric perception. Yes, it is energy perceiving energy. To talk about etheric vision with myself not being a complete clairvoyant or anything like that, it's a difficult thing. But let's just talk about some of the phenomena anyway. When one has one's consciousness in energy and is perceiving energy, one is sensitive to the stuff of energy and not material stuff. That's important. Now, we've said it several times today, everything we see here in this world is outer. But the inner, all of the spiritual worlds are inward, and the further you go into the realms of spirit, the more inward they are. The ethers form a transition between the outer and the inner, so they have an inward dimension, and that inward dimension to the consciousness that we have now in the material world is like a throughness. You can see right through stuff. What happens with X-rays, where you can see different levels of things at the same time when it's imposed on the X-ray film, approximates what you can do with etheric vision. But everything is suspended. Time and space are experienced differently. Since there is a throughness, that throughness goes all the way through the etheric world. And everything is alive and everything is active. Very important point. You're dealing with live, active life. One can see how matter, even our physical body, is suspended in life. It's just slowed down life and is suspended in life. We actually live in a sea of life. In the same way that we have the feeling here of stuff and of being grounded, in the ethers one experiences, especially if one is out of the body, one experiences life. So the experience of not having gravity that the astronauts describe is very much identical to what people describe when they're first out of their body, functioning in their etheric soul body. They feel like they're falling, because that's the way we experience suspension, is when we're falling. However, you don't come down. You live in a suspended state, and you live in a falling state, and it takes a little while to get used to that. One can see that the planets, just like our bodies, are suspended. I don't know how to say it. If you're seeing and experiencing in the etheric world, it's as though your whole body is just floating along, and you move, and you don't pay attention to the gravitational effect, you pay attention to the suspension. Now, the planets, as big as they are easily movable when they're suspended. I don't know if any of you have ever gone swimming in a lake in the North Woods where there has been logging, and a huge log that you couldn't even roll. If you put your shoulder into it on land, you can take that log and you can move it around with your finger if it's suspended. Similarly, all of the material world is suspended in the ethers. But it's not quite a buoyancy suspension, because the ethers are right within, so that every atom of material stuff is suspended in life. So that really what is the organization of our body is something that can be pulled apart. It can be unraveled if one knows how to do that. It's quite an experience. One can perceive the texture of light or life energy. Most people at the very beginning of etheric vision see that light is cobwebbed. That what is called the electromagnetic spectrum, which is energy that's in a deathly state, that is dying, It's not quite the same thing as in the ethers, but that whole spectrum is there as it's cobwebbed with rainbows. If you are in a semi-darkened room, not like this, but like that corner without the wires, if you look into where three dimensions come together, and you're in a semi-darkened room, when you look at the three dimensions coming in, you can, in your consciousness, begin to see the throughness into light. And in such a case, you see that it is filled with suspended, vibrating little rainbows. That's one etheric phenomenon. It's very hard to describe all of those kinds of things. In the other way, you get the feeling of suspension or flatness if you put your head in the corner where the three dimensions come together and follow all three dimensions out to infinity, and they become points of an equilateral triangle. But when you do that with your consciousness, you put yourself into what is something like a flat space, but a flat space that has throughness. It's a form of study that's called projective geometry. And projective geometry is how all of the things in the three-dimensional world come into being from the interdimensional worlds that seem flat. And so it is, when somebody says that you put a dunce in the corner is the best place to learn, especially if they put a dunce cap on them, which focuses, which produces a little etheric vortex inside. So looking into corners and looking out of corners. I have not been so lucky yet, but when I lived here, I have friends that saw various etheric entities, nature spirits, fairies, things like that. They aren't like, or they weren't so much like Walt Disney creatures until Walt Disney forced them into looking like that. They're much more indistinct creatures, and they have faces. The thing is with nature spirits, they take on the character of what they see. And if they see human beings that see them consciously, the self-conscious communication is carried between the two beings. This is why a lot of gnomic, the gnomes work primarily in the chemical ether. And from the times of late Atlantis, people could still see into the ethers. And when they would see the gnomes, there would be a communication of consciousness. And the Atlanteans had those flat, almost pointed heads, some of the late ones. And as a consequence, they had wraparound like eyes, like you see in Egyptian paintings. And if you look, a lot of gnomic creatures, when they have faces or face-likes, they have wraparound eyes. And but at any rate, you can see all of those things. You can see ghosts. There's a wonderful book by a Christian seer that was associated with the Theosophical Society. His name is Jeffrey Hodson. Yes. And Yes.
And is that other lady under pseudonym education?
Yes. Did the same sort of thing. And it's very interesting to note he couldn't publish it within the Theosophical Society because there would have been the same battles that caused Rudolf Steiner to leave the Theosophical Society. Even though some of Madame Blavatsky's inner circle said that Christ Jesus was the singular manifestation of the soul, Jeffrey Hodson has published that, but in a very obscure article, because he saw that Christ Jesus is a fact, a cosmic fact. But at any rate, those are things that one can see. Now, you don't focus the same way you focus in the world. You focus in the field. You take in the whole. The more you go into the spiritual world, the more you look at wholes, and the less you look at details. The spiritual world is more unified, and there isn't that much detail like there is in this realm. You can see the vital constitution of one. If we put as much energy into spiritual development as we do into medicine and things like that, we could see all illnesses as they develop in the body. Because we can see the body in function. If you work as an invisible helper, sometimes you're allowed to bring back those experiences. You're taught how the body works, and you see it with etheric vision, and you can see the systems working, and you can see the within of them as they're going on. And you can see the illnesses and the instructions, things like that. And you can even relate them to the character of the attitudes that produce the illnesses. Strange things. A lot of people talk about when a person is sweating, the organic forms, the basis of the rings of biochemistry are thrown off where a person is sweating, like under the arms, and you see all the kinds of geometric forms that are being thrown off. You have to figure out what they are. It takes a long time on things like that. And you can see etheric thought forms, not all of which are and concrete as things here. For example, sometimes if you're thinking good thoughts to someone and complimenting to them, something like a flower-like form is communicated to them through the inner worlds. But it's purposeless to talk about things like this. But you do have power. You do have power, even if you just see the etheric aura around the edge of the physical body, especially at certain times of the day. When I was very young on the path, I was filled with inspiration, and occasionally I could see the etheric aura, the part that was close to the body of the life ether. And I worked for the Borden's Milk Company, and at sunset, it's much easier to see the ether right after sunset. If you can see it there at the time, you're most likely going to see it. And right after sunset, I was parking a truck, and there was this very dear man that was a mechanic. His name was Sabino Vega. He was just a dandy person. And we befriended each other, and he had a kid that the kid loved to climb trees, and the kid loved to hang by his knees upside down on a branch, but every time he did, the upside down perspective was funny to him, and he would start laughing, and he'd laugh, and he'd laugh, and then he'd lose control and fall down, and there'd be another broken arm. But I didn't know the power that you have. And I was looking at Sabino across this lot, and it was right at that magic hour after sunset, and I could see that little rim of light. I could say, he's in a healthy state, or I said something like that, and commenting on the nature of his etheric body, which was quite strong, quite distinct. And I'm backing the truck in, because you had to charge the batteries for the refrigerators at night, and I'm backing the truck in, and I'm no sooner get the truck back in, and he's at the door of the truck, and he said, "What did you just think?" Immediately, when you see the etheric aura, you can project thought forms to someone else, and you can act as a hypnotist, and you can knock them out of their body, and most people are not discriminating. They do not know that the thought forms are not their own. Only someone who practices inwardly knows the tone of their own thought form. This is exactly what we hear in the Bible. We will know the shepherd's voice, and the sheep will follow the shepherd. And when there is that gigantic word that dissolves the physical earth, we will be unified in Christ Jesus. Because we will know the Master's voice, and we will be attuned to that purity of consciousness, that purity of love. So things like that are real. It's not hard to become a hypnotist or anything like that. You can actually even produce inner images for other people.
some things that are complicated in material blindness are easy to perceive at other times. Like, you have the control, you can see atoms. You can see, like, for example, Feynman, the great physicist, said, you have to be doing something wrong. For us to predict the path of a particle, which takes, like millions or billions of a second, where it's going to move to from one place to another, he said this takes us hours of computer time, massive computers. It's something we have to, we're doing something wrong. Clairvoyance, with the theory of clairvoyance, can see those paths. They can see the spirals that are an atom. Atomic physicists say that the path of an electron is a very complex spiral that the tails meet after so many revolutions. It's visible. If you have a great vision, it's right there for you. What? Yes, Babbitt's atom is much more than that. Babbitt's atom is a microcosmic image of, that is the primordial atom, a microcosmic image of the path of the whole of the cosmos. We're talking about a book by Edwin Babbitt called Principles of Light and Color. He was an early seer that unfolded clairvoyance, and he wrote a book called Principles of Light and Color. Get it if you can. You can still get some of the original versions, but it is costly to get the original versions. There are versions it was reprinted in the 60s, and it was edited by a man called Farian Briere, and he chopped it up. You want to get the original, not the chopped up one. You know who was one of the editors of the original? So they knew each other. It's kind of senseless to just talk about this, because it's good to whet our appetite, cause us to work harder, cause us to serve more so that we can see more of reality and we can be whole people. That's real healing, when we're whole and we can see in that entire spectrum of the cosmic deep substance. But for the most part, to talk about these things, it's vanity. Anytime you're talking about phenomena, it's vanity. If you were working on healing and two clairvoyants were looking at an obstruction in somebody's etheric body that was manifest in the physical body, to compare notes and ideas of how to deal with it in healing, that would not be vanity. But as we're talking about it, it's vanity. It's not something I want to continue on with. The whole idea is that these things are available to us. We have simple exercises that we can develop the ability to open up clairvoyance later on. Probably starting next week, we're going to talk about exercises. But the most important part is the soul power. Living the life that brings in the stuff that allows us to be able to do these things is all important. And the soul power comes character. When we have character and soul power, all of these faculties are available to us. We will be talking about soul growth probably the week after. The last 3 talks will be on soul and soul growth. And the last one, probably on the 10th, will be the most important talk as far as spiritual philosophy is concerned. Let's close with the